The millionaire's son lost his voice on the day his mother died. The trauma locked him in a silence that the best doctors in the world couldn't break. The father, a man who could buy anything, couldn't buy back his son's voice. It was in this atmosphere of sadness that a simple Italian cleaning lady was hired. Then one day, the father heard a soft and familiar singing coming from the room. He ran, his heart tight, and the scene he found made him break down in tears. The cleaning lady was singing the same Italian opera that the boy's deceased mother used to sing to him to sleep. And the boy, for the first time in years, was singing along. The empire Arthur Blackwood built was a monument to success, a colossus of steel and glass whose profits multiplied into figures most people would never see. His fortune, amassed through shrewd investments in tech stocks and an infallible instinct for business, was vast, an ocean of capital that afforded him any whim. His home, a sprawling estate perched on a hill overlooking the city skyline, was the physical proof of this triumph. The walls were adorned with masterpieces. The polished marble floors reflected the light from crystal chandeliers, and every object seemed to whisper of his immense wealth. However, the house was also a sanctuary of silence and pain. The loudest sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the great hall, a sound that only accentuated the emptiness. Since Elena, his wife, a talented and vibrant opera singer, had passed away a year ago, the most precious sound of all had vanished. The voice of their only son, Leo. The boy, just 7 years old, had retreated into a fortress of silence that the best and most expensive doctors in the world could not breach. Selective mutism, they diagnosed, a profound manifestation of trauma. Arthur, a man accustomed to commanding, to making decisions that moved millions of dollars and watching the world bend to his will, was powerless before his son's silence. He watched from the doorway of the playroom, a space that should have echoed with laughter and childish chatter, but was now a stage for frustration. The governess, Mrs. Higgins, a woman who prized order and discipline above all else, treated Leo's silence like a disease to be cured with a rigid routine and relentless therapies. She held up a flashcard with a picture of an apple. "Leo," she said, her voice clear and devoid of emotion. "Say apple. It's a simple word. You know how to say it." Leo didn't look at her. His large brown eyes, so much like Elena's, were fixed on a spot on the wall far away. He wasn't being stubborn, he simply wasn't there. His spirit seemed to have withdrawn to a place no one could reach. The governor sighed, a sharp sound of impatience. "We've been trying for months. Your father spends a fortune on these methods, and you don't cooperate." The word fortune sounded like an insult to Arthur. He invested everything he had, not just his money but his soul, to see his son well, and all he received in return was this void. He entered the room, the scent of antiseptic and the impeccable order suffocating him. "That's enough for today, Mrs. Higgins," he said, his voice lower than he intended. The governess rose, smoothing a dress without a single crease. "Mr. Blackwood, consistency is key. Interrupting the session only reinforces the behavior." Arthur knelt before his son, ignoring the woman. He touched Leo's shoulder, feeling the small tension beneath the silk pajamas. "Leo," he whispered. "Son." Nothing. It was like speaking to an exquisitely carved statue. The ache in Arthur's chest was a physical pressure, a weight none of his financial assets could alleviate. He looked around the perfect house, at the perfect life he had built, and realized it was all a facade. It was an empty shell, without the melody of his wife's voice, without the sound of his son's laughter. Desperate, he made a decision that went against all his business logic. He didn't need another specialist, another expensive therapy. He needed something different. He needed life. That night, he dismissed the governess early and, in his lavish office, did something he hadn't done in years. He looked for ordinary, mundane help. On a domestic employment agency website, his eyes scanned dozens of qualified profiles until they stopped on one that was unremarkable, except for one line in the bio: enjoys singing Italian folk songs while she works. The name was Isabella Rossi, and in the crushing silence of his mansion, the simple mention of a song felt like a promise, a thread of hope he clung to with the desperation of a drowning man. Isabella Rossi arrived the next morning, a small, warm figure who seemed out of place in the grand, cold setting of the Blackwood estate. Her sensible shoes made a soft, solitary sound on the polished marble of the entryway, a sound that was immediately swallowed by the oppressive silence of the place. She looked up at the vaulted ceiling and the chandelier that resembled a cluster of frozen stars and felt a chill that wasn't from the cold. The house wasn't just quiet. It felt like it was in mourning, each room a mausoleum for guarded memories. Mrs. Higgins greeted her with the frigid efficiency of an automaton. Her thin lips barely curved into a smile as she handed Isabella a clipboard with a detailed list of tasks and a starched uniform. "Welcome, Ms. Rossi. Your duties are clearly outlined. Cleaning is to be done with minimal noise. Mr. Blackwood values tranquility for his business, and more importantly, Leo's environment must be controlled. No excessive stimuli." The governess paused, her small, sharp eyes fixed on Isabella. "That means no unnecessary chatter, no radio, and absolutely no singing." Isabella just nodded, her gentle eyes taking in the woman's severity. She didn't argue. She understood there were rules here, walls built not just of brick, but of pain. Her first task was the long second-floor hallway where the bedrooms were. The doors were all closed, except for one at the far end, Leo's room. As she ran a soft cloth over the mahogany banister, she saw him. He was sitting on the floor, surrounded by perfectly aligned wooden blocks, but building nothing. His eyes were lost, fixed on the dust motes dancing in a sunbeam slicing through the window. He was the very picture of loneliness. Isabella's heart ached. She continued her work, moving with a quiet grace. But the silence, Mrs. Higgins demanded, was different from the silence that emanated from the boy. The governess's was sterile, his was full of unsaid words. Unable to contain herself completely, she began to hum. It wasn't a song, just a soft, almost inaudible melody, an old aria from her homeland that her nonna used to sing to soothe away nighttime fears. It was almost imperceptible, but it happened. Leo stopped looking at the sunbeam, his head, almost involuntarily, turned a millimeter in the direction of the sound. His eyes, once vacant, flickered with a fleeting glimmer of curiosity. It was a moment so brief it could have been imagined, but Isabella saw it. She didn't react, didn't smile, didn't do anything that might startle him. She just kept humming, the melody weaving a thread of warmth into the cold corridor air. Suddenly, Mrs. Higgins's sharp voice broke the spell. "Miss Rossi, what did I say about noise?" The governess stood at the other end of the hall, hands on her hips, her face a mask of disapproval. Leo's head snapped back to the wall, the tiny moment of connection shattered. "I apologize," Isabella said softly. "It's an old habit." Mrs. Higgins marched toward her, her presence a wave of frigid air. "It's a habit that must be broken, immediately. He is in therapy. Every element of his day is calculated. Your impromptu music is not part of the plan." That evening, exhausted, Isabella was in the vast kitchen polishing the family silver, an extra task Mrs. Higgins had given her as a sort of veiled punishment. The day had been long, and the weight of the house's sadness seemed to have settled on her shoulders. Arthur arrived late, his mind buzzing with stock market figures and the details of a major cryptocurrency investment that promised to further swell his already vast fortune. He passed Mrs. Higgins in the hall, who gave him her usual clinical report. No change in Leo's state. He refused to identify colors today. The day proceeded without incident. Disappointed, as always, Arthur continued toward his office. As he passed the kitchen door, he heard something, A sound so soft it was nearly lost in the silence. It was a voice, a woman's voice, singing a lullaby in Italian that he hadn't heard in a year. A lullaby Elena used to sing to Leo every single night. He stopped, his hand frozen on the brass doorknob, his heart hammering against his ribs. For an instant, the grief and longing hit him with such force he could barely breathe, but beneath the pain, something else bloomed, a spark of warmth he thought had been extinguished forever. Arthur opened the kitchen door slowly, the soft click of the latch sounding like thunder in the quiet house. Isabella startled, spinning around with a dish towel in her hand, her eyes wide with fear and guilt, the song dying on her lips. The silence returned, heavier and denser than before. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Arthur, a titan of the business world, a man whose name made the stock market tremble, felt completely disarmed. He didn't see a cleaner who had broken the rules. He saw a woman whose voice had, for an instant, resurrected a cherished ghost. "That song," he began, his voice hoarse, thick with an emotion he struggled to suppress. "Where did you learn it?" Isabella wrung the towel in her hands, her gaze lowered. "It is a lullaby from my home, sir. My grandmother sang it to me." The simplicity of the answer struck him. It wasn't a strategy, not a therapy. It was just a memory, an echo of affection. "My wife, Elena, she sang that same song to our son," he said, the words coming with difficulty. A silent understanding passed between them. Isabella looked up, and in her eyes Arthur saw not pity, but a deep, resonant empathy. "It is a beautiful song," she said softly, "to soothe the soul." In that moment, Arthur made a silent decision. Mrs. Higgins and her methods, her reports and her theories were a high-cost investment with no emotional return. He managed a net worth of billions, dealt with assets and liabilities with the cash flow of an empire, but his most precious asset, his son's happiness, was in a deep recession. "Please," he said, surprising himself, "don't stop singing because of her rules. Just be discreet." Isabella nodded, a small smile of relief touching her lips. She said nothing, but her look held a promise. In the days that followed, the house subtly changed. Isabella didn't sing loudly, but the melody was always there, a whisper in the halls, a soft hum as she dusted the furniture. And Leo noticed he began to follow the sound. Isabella would see him out of the corner of her eye, a small shadow watching her from a distance, always silent, but with a new intensity in his gaze. Mrs. Higgins, oblivious to Arthur's tacit permission, grew increasingly irritated with what she called Isabella's musical insubordination, but she could never quite catch her in the act. Leo's focus, however, began to fixate on one specific spot in the house, the grand oak double doors at the end of the west wing, the music room. It had been locked since Elena's passing, a time capsule containing her grand piano, her sheet music, the echo of her art. One day, Isabella found Leo there, his face pressed against the cool wood, his ear against the brass keyhole. He wasn't trying to get in, he was listening to the silence, perhaps, or to the ghosts of melodies that once filled the space. The sight broke Isabella's heart. It was the clearest picture of longing she had ever seen. She approached slowly, but before she could say anything, Mrs. Higgins appeared down the hall like a hawk. "Leo, get away from there at once," she commanded, her voice a whip. "You know this room is forbidden. There is nothing in there for you, only painful memories that disrupt your therapy." She took the boy by the arm, not violently, but with a cold firmness that was somehow worse. "Come along. It's time for your speech exercises." She led him away, and Leo followed without resistance, his small body rigid. But he glanced back over his shoulder, just once, at the door. And his gaze wasn't for the door, it was for Isabella. It was a look of appeal, a silent plea that shot down the corridor and lodged itself directly in Isabella's soul. That afternoon, while cleaning a tall bookshelf in the hallway, her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic, tucked behind a row of antique books. It was a key, an ornate brass key she recognized immediately. Isabella's heart hammered. It was the key to the music room. She looked at the closed door, then at the key in her palm. Mrs. Higgins would kill her. Mr. Blackwood could fire her. But the look in Leo's eyes, that was a risk she felt she had to take. The weight of the brass key in Isabella's hand was far greater than its physical heft. It was the weight of a decision, a line between obedience and compassion. She glanced down the hall, where Mrs. Higgins was leading Leo to another sterile, silent therapy session. The governess was the embodiment of order, of control, a crisis manager who treated a child's grief like a liability to be eliminated from the house's emotional balance sheet. To Mrs. Higgins, the music room was a risky asset, a trigger that could depreciate all the progress she believed she was making. But Isabella saw it differently. The room wasn't a shrine to pain, but a vault of memories, and perhaps the only inheritance that truly mattered to Leo. The boy didn't need more silence and rules. He needed a connection to the mother he had lost, and music was their language. The next day, Isabella waited for the right moment. Mrs. Higgins had a weekly video conference with a team of psychologists in Zurich, a consultation Arthur paid for in euros, and which, in Isabella's opinion, produced more reports than results. During this hour, the governess would lock herself in her office, ensuring nothing disturbed her presentation on Leo's behavioral metrics. The boy, as usual, was in his room, building a tower of blocks with an almost robotic precision. Isabella approached his bedroom door. She said nothing. She just looked at him, then glanced meaningfully toward the music room. An understanding passed between them, a communication that needed no sound. Leo's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time, a clear emotion shone on his face. Anticipation. Slowly, he got up, abandoning his tower. Tiptoeing like two conspirators on a secret mission, they went to the grand oak doors. Isabella's heart pounded against her ribs. She checked both ways down the silent hall before sliding the key into the lock. The click of the mechanism sounded deafeningly loud, a sound that seemed to break a year-long spell. She pushed the door, and it swung open with a soft groan. A scent of dust, old wood, and the faint perfume of jasmine, Elena's scent, enveloped them. The room was shrouded in gloom, the furniture covered in white sheets, like ghosts waiting to be awakened. In the center, under the largest of the sheets, was the unmistakable shape of a grand piano. Leo entered the room first, his small steps hesitant on the Persian rug. He looked like an explorer entering a sacred tomb. He didn't run to the piano. Instead, his tiny fingers traced the edge of a music stand, touched the velvet cover of a photo album left on an armchair. He was absorbing his mother's presence. Isabella stayed by the door, giving him space. She felt she was witnessing something deeply private. She wasn't just a cleaner tidying a room. She was a guardian opening a door to healing. Leo finally approached the piano. He didn't try to remove the sheet. Instead, just as he had done at the hallway door, he pressed his ear to the covered wood, closing his eyes. What was he listening for? The Beethoven sonatas Elena had loved, the lullabies she'd composed just for him. Isabella didn't know, but the image of that small child, trying to draw sound from silence, was the most heartbreaking and hopeful thing she had ever seen. She glanced at the clock. Their time was running out. Mrs. Higgins's meeting would be over soon. "Leo," she whispered, the first word spoken in that sacred space. The boy didn't move. He was in another world, a world where the music still played. With a heavy heart, Isabella knew she had to get him out of there. But how could she close the door to the one place where he seemed to be truly seeking a connection? As she struggled with the dilemma, she heard a sound from downstairs. The door to Mrs. Higgins's office opening far earlier than expected. Panic, cold and sharp. pierced Isabella's chest. The sound of the office door opening downstairs was the trigger on a time bomb. In seconds, Mrs. Higgins would be coming up the stairs, her exacting inspection sweeping the hall. Isabella turned to Leo, who was still lost to the world, eyes closed, ear pressed to the dust-covered piano. His face was serene, lost in a world of silent echoes. "Leo," she whispered, urgency coloring her voice, "we have to go. Now." For the first time, he responded to a direct command from her. His eyes snapped open, and in them was not the usual vacancy, but a clear, intelligent alarm. He understood the danger. Serenity was replaced by a tense complicity. He pushed away from the piano, his small movement stirring a cloud of dust that danced in the dim light, a silent witness to their transgression. Isabella took his hand. His skin was cool, but his grip was firm. They slipped out of the room like shadows, and she pulled the heavy oak door shut, turning the key in the lock with infinite care to muffle the sound of the click. The metal obeyed, with a nearly inaudible protest. She slid the key back into her apron pocket the exact moment Mrs. Higgins's head appeared at the top of the stairs. The governess paused, her hawk-like eyes scanning the hallway. Her gaze landed on the two of them, standing just a little too close to the forbidden door. Isabella felt her blood run cold. What are you two doing here?" Mrs. Higgins asked, her voice dangerously calm. Isabella forced her heart to slow. Leo was restless. "I brought him for a walk down the hall to calm him, ma'am." The excuse sounded flimsy, even to her own ears. Mrs. Higgins narrowed her eyes. She took a step forward, her nose twitching subtly, as if she could smell the disobedience in the air. "Restless. He seemed perfectly stable during my morning observations." She looked at Leo, who had retreated into his mask of indifference, but his fingers were still laced tightly with Isabella's. This small show of connection did not go unnoticed by the governess. She made a disapproving sound. "Take him back to his room. And Missy Rossi, focus on your duties. The dining room silver needs additional polishing." It was a dismissal, a warning. Meanwhile, in his downtown office, Arthur Blackwood stared at a chart showing the price of gold skyrocketing. His investments were turning an extraordinary profit, dividends from his stocks accumulating, further strengthening an empire that already seemed unshakable. But the satisfaction he felt was hollow, fleeting. He looked out the panoramic window at the city sprawling below him, a chessboard on which he was the king. What good was all this wealth, all this power, if he couldn't hear his own son's voice? Every dollar that flowed into his accounts seemed to widen the gap between him and the solution to Leo's problem. He was funding the best minds, but they were failing. The only spark of hope had come from an unexpected place, the soft melody of a cleaner. That sound, so simple and cost-free, seemed to hold more value than all his assets combined. Back at the estate, Isabella spent the rest of the afternoon with a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She had crossed a line. She had risked her job, her employer's trust, on an impulse. But when she remembered the look on Leo's face inside the music room, the way he connected with his mother's memory, she knew she would do it all again. At the end of her shift, before leaving, she passed quietly by Leo's open door to peek in. He wasn't with his blocks. He was sitting at his small desk, his back to the door, focused on a piece of paper. Curiosity won over caution, and Isabella stepped into the room. That's when she saw it. Spread across the desk was a drawing, done in black crayon, with hesitant but unmistakable lines, was the outline of a grand piano. In the space above the keyboard, where a musician would sit, he had drawn a small stick figure with long, flowing hair. He didn't look at Isabella, but with an almost imperceptible movement, he pushed the paper an inch in her direction. It was a message, a confession, a shared secret. And in the silence of that room, Isabella felt it wasn't just a drawing, it was the first note of a song beginning to awaken. The drawing of the piano became the silent bond between Isabella and Leo. It was a confirmation that the visit to the music room had not just been a transgression of rules, but the opening of a channel. Every day, Isabella would find a new drawing at her cleaning station. A keyboard, a treble clef, crooked musical notes that seemed to dance on the page. They were fragments of a conversation Leo couldn't verbalize. Mrs. Higgins saw the drawings and dismissed them as meaningless scribbles, more proof of the boy's regression away from her structured exercises. He should be practicing the alphabet, not drawing fanciful objects, she remarked acidly to Isabella, tearing a particularly detailed drawing of a harp and tossing it in the trash. Isabella rescued the scraps of paper later, her heart aching, and saved them like treasures. She knew she had to find a way to nurture this spark without raising suspicion. The key to the music room burned in her pocket, a constant temptation. But another risky visit was out of the question. The governess watched her more keenly than ever, monitoring her movements, timing her tasks. The estate, already quiet, now seemed to have ears in every wall. Isabella changed her tactic. If she couldn't bring Leo to the music, she would bring the music to him in small, safe doses. She began leaving music-related objects where he would be sure to find them. One day, she accidentally dropped a small tuning fork from her pocket near the playroom. Hours later, she found it on Leo's nightstand. Another day, she left an old magazine about opera open to a page with a photo of a famous soprano, her dark hair and expressive eyes vaguely reminiscent of Elena. The boy spent a long time tracing the outline of the singer's face with his finger. Arthur, meanwhile, was growing more immersed in his world of high finance. A new clean tech investment fund was demanding all his attention, promising a return that could add another zero to his already astronomical net worth. He spent nights awake, analyzing charts, holding conference calls with investors in Tokyo and Frankfurt, speaking the universal language of money, yet in rare, quiet moments he would find himself staring into space, the exhilaration of a successful deal fading to leave behind the bitter residue of his personal failure. He would remember the lullaby Isabella had sung and wonder if he'd missed an important clue. He had given her a vague permission to sing, but he had been so distracted by his business that he hadn't followed up on what came next. Mrs. Higgins's mention of Leo's obsessive scribbles concerned him, but he interpreted it through the governess's clinical filter, a symptom, not a message. The tension in the house reached a new peak on a rainy afternoon. Mrs. Higgins had decided Leo needed aversion therapy for his interest in music. Her twisted logic was that if he associated it with something negative, he would abandon the fixation. She took him to the front of the music room door and began speaking in a severe, monotone voice about how that room represented the past, sadness, and how his mother was not coming back. Isabella was cleaning the hallway windows and heard everything. Her blood boiled. She saw Leo's body stiffen, his small fists clenching at his sides. The governess was turning a sanctuary into a scene of punishment. Unable to stop herself, Isabella began to hum. This time, it wasn't a discreet hum. It was a clear melody, a Puccini aria full of passion and defiance, her voice rising softly but with enough power to fill the corridor. Mrs. Higgins stopped talking abruptly, turning to Isabella with a face red with fury. "I will not warn you again, Ms. Rossi," she hissed. "Your insubordination is intolerable." But before she could continue, something happened. Leo, who had his back to both women, turned his head. His eyes, which Isabella expected to be filled with fear or anguish, were shining with a different emotion. And then he made a sound. It was not a word, not even a syllable. It was a low, hesitant hum that tried to follow Isabella's melody. It was off-key, faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was the first voluntary vocal sound Leo had made in a year. Both women froze, staring at the boy. Mrs. Higgins looked shocked, confused. as if her therapy manuals didn't have a chapter for this. Isabella, on the other hand, felt a wave of triumph and hope so overwhelming it almost brought her to her knees. Leo's sound was not a response to the governess's therapy. It was an echo of her song. Leo's hesitant hum hung in the hallway air, a sound so fragile a breath could have undone it. For Mrs. Higgins, it was an anomaly, a glitch in the programming she couldn't compute. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, her words of reprimand dying before they were born. But for Isabella, that sound was a miracle, the first crack in the fortress of silence. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't stop humming. Instead, she softened the melody even further, turning the defiant aria into a gentle invitation, weaving a cocoon of sound around the boy, protecting that first tenuous attempt at communication. Leo hummed again, a little louder, a little more confident, his eyes locked on Isabella's as if she were a lighthouse in a dense fog. At that exact instant, Arthur Blackwood came home. He had left a crucial meeting about acquiring a crypto startup early, driven by an inexplicable impulse, a feeling that he needed to be home. He walked up the stairs quietly, the weariness of the day heavy on his shoulders, and stopped at the top, witnessing the scene unfold. He saw the governess, paralyzed with bewilderment. He saw the cleaner, her face illuminated with pure emotion, and he heard it. He heard the most unlikely duet, Isabella's clear, warm melody and his son's trembling hum. The sound of Leo, however faint, hit Arthur with the force of a tidal wave. He dropped his leather briefcase, which fell to the floor with a dull thud, breaking the spell. Everyone turned to him. Leo's hum ceased instantly. Mrs. Higgins regained her composure, seeing an opportunity to spin the narrative in her favor. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice laced with a false, professional urgency, "as you can see, we are having a breakthrough. My technique of direct trauma confrontation is finally yielding results." Arthur barely heard her. His eyes were fixed on his son, who was now staring at the floor, shrinking into himself as if the sound he'd just made was a betrayal. Arthur's heart broke, not from pain, but from a cold, crystalline fury. He finally saw it all clearly. He saw the governess's rigidity not as professionalism, but as cruelty. He saw her methods not as therapy, but as torture. And he saw what Isabella was doing, not as a breach of rules, but as an act of love. He walked slowly down the hall, his footsteps echoing in the tense silence. He didn't stop in front of Mrs. Higgins. Instead, he went to Isabella. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice low, but carrying a weight that made the air vibrate. Before Isabella could answer, Mrs. Higgins interjected, "I was conducting the session as planned." Miss Rossi, once again, interrupted with her inappropriate singing, confusing the child. Arthur turned to the governess, and for the first time, she saw the man who commanded $1 billion empire, the man whose calm could freeze boardrooms. "Confusing him," he repeated, his voice glacial. "We heard my son make a sound for the first time in a year, and it didn't sound confused to me. It sounded like a response." It was then that Isabella, moved by a courage she didn't know she possessed, stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "Leo doesn't need confrontation, he needs connection. The music isn't the source of his pain, it's the bridge back to us." She glanced at the locked music room door. It was his inheritance. The word inheritance struck Arthur. He thought of inheritance in terms of stocks, property, a vast estate to be transferred. But there, in that hallway, he understood the true legacy Elena had left. It wasn't the money, the fortune, or the wealth. It was the music. Mrs. Higgins, feeling the power slip through her fingers, played her last card. "Sir, this is unacceptable. This woman's interference is undermining years of therapeutic work. Either she and her sentimental, unprofessional methods go, or I can no longer be responsible for his progress." The ultimatum hung in the air. The choice was clear. The clinical expert with her metrics or the cleaner with her melody. For Arthur, the decision was instantaneous, like buying a promising stock. He looked at Mrs. Higgins's furious face and then at Isabella's hopeful one. Then he knelt in front of Leo, who finally looked up. "Son," Arthur said, his voice cracking, do you want to play some piano?" And in the ensuing silence, Leo, for the first time in a year, nodded his head, a single, unmistakable yes. Mrs. Higgins' departure was as efficient and emotionless as her tenure. Arthur handled it the way he knew best, like a business transaction. He wired a generous severance package into her account, an amount that was a small fraction of the interest his investments earned in a single day, ensuring her silence and her immediate exit. When the front door closed behind her, the atmosphere in the estate instantly changed. The air, once rarefied and sterile, seemed to expand. The oppressive silence dissipated, replaced by a different quiet, an expectant quiet, like a conductor's pause before the first bar of a symphony. Arthur, Isabella, and Leo stood in the hallway, an unlikely trio united by a decision that had altered the ecosystem of their lives. The billionaire, the cleaner, and the silent boy. Arthur felt strangely vulnerable, stripped of the charts and spreadsheets that were the only maps he knew how to read. He turned to Isabella, the brass key in his hand. In a gesture that felt monumental, he held it out to her. "I think this belongs to you now," he said. It wasn't just a key, it was an act of surrender. The transfer of one of his most precious assets, the hope for his son's recovery, into her hands. Isabella accepted the key, her fingers brushing against his. She said nothing, but her gaze conveyed a promise of care and respect. Together, the three of them walked to the music room door. This time, there was no secrecy, no fear. Isabella unlocked the door, and the light from the hallway spilled over the ghostly furniture. Arthur hadn't stepped inside since the day Eleanor was gone. The grief was too great a liability on his emotional balance sheet. But now, standing beside his son, he crossed the threshold. The scent of jasmine, faint and persistent, hit him, and for a moment the pain was so sharp he nearly retreated. Leo, however, walked into the room with a solemnity that belied his age. He looked like a prince reclaiming his lost kingdom. Isabella, with remarkable intuition, didn't rush him. She began removing the white sheets from the furniture one by one, revealing velvet armchairs, shelves packed with sheet music, the gilded harp in the corner. Each uncovered object seemed to bring a little more life back into the room. Finally, she approached the piano. With a slow, ceremonial flourish, she pulled back the sheet. The Steinway Grand, black and gleaming, emerged from the dust like a magnificent creature waking from a long slumber. It was a work of art, an asset of inestimable value, but to Arthur, its true worth lay in the memories it held. Leo approached the piano, his small body vibrating with emotion. He stopped beside the bench, his hand hovering inches from the ivory keys, afraid to touch them, as if the sound might break the spell. Arthur held his breath. He had risked capital on high-stakes ventures, invested in volatile stocks and Bitcoin without blinking. But never in his life had he felt so exposed, so terrified and hopeful as he did in that moment. Isabella, sensing the boy's hesitation, sat on the bench. Not in the center, but to one side, leaving an inviting space. She didn't speak a word. She just began to hum the same melody from before, soft and reassuring. The sound enveloped Leo, giving him courage. Slowly, he climbed onto the bench and sat beside her. His index finger, tiny and hesitant, reached out and pressed a single key, middle C. The note, clear and pure, echoed in the silent room. It was the first musical sound in that room in over a year. Arthur felt tears burn his eyes. Then Leo played another note, and another, and another. They weren't random. A melody began to form, simple, hesitant, but unmistakable. Arthur felt the floor drop out from under him. His heart stopped, then raced. He knew that melody. He knew it as well as he knew the rhythm of the stock market. They were the first notes of the lullaby Elena had composed for Leo, a song she had never written down, a melody that existed only in the memories of the three of them. The melody of the lullaby, played with the one-fingered simplicity of a child, filled the music room and Arthur's heart. Each hesitant note was a blow against his carefully constructed armor, the same armor that allowed him to navigate the ruthless world of business, where emotion was a liability. Here, in his sanctuary of broken silence, he was utterly exposed. The tears he had suppressed for a year finally came, silent and hot, tracing a path down his face. He didn't try to hide them. He collapsed into a velvet armchair, his body shaking with the weight of the moment. It wasn't just the sound of the piano. It was the tangible proof that Eleanor's essence, her music, still lived inside his son. It was an inheritance far more valuable than his entire fortune in dollars and gold. Leo continued to play, his small fingers moving over the keyboard with a memory that seemed to reside more in his heart than in his mind. Isabella sat beside him, a calm, steady presence. She didn't correct him, didn't guide him with words. Instead, she began to hum along, her voice a soft, velvety counterpoint to the piano's crystalline notes. She became the harmony to his melody, the support that allowed his fragile musical expression to feel safe. Arthur watched the two of them, the woman he had hired to clean his house and the son he couldn't reach, and saw a connection so deep and natural it took his breath away. They didn't need words. Music was their language, a form of communication that transcended therapy and medicine. In that instant, Arthur didn't see a boy with selective mutism and an improvised caregiver. He saw two musicians, two souls who understood each other on a level he, with all his intellectual and financial capital, had never managed. Mrs. Higgins's departure left an administrative vacuum in the house, but Arthur realized her role had, in fact, been obsolete. The rigid routines, the therapy sessions, and the progress reports were replaced by something far more organic and effective. Afternoons in the music room, Isabella, without ever being formally asked, slipped into the role of Leo's caregiver. She still performed her cleaning duties, but the center of her days was now the piano. She didn't impose schedules. She simply left the music room door open, and Leo always came. He was drawn to the room like a ship to a lighthouse. They started with the lullaby, playing it over and over until Leo's fingers grew more confident. Then Isabella began to introduce other melodies, Italian folk songs from her childhood, simplified opera arias. She would sing the words softly, and Leo would try to follow along on the piano. Arthur began to readjust his own life. He delegated meetings, postponed business trips, and started leaving his office earlier. He was drawn home by the same sound that drew Leo. Often, he would stand outside the music room, hidden from view, just listening. He listened to Isabella's melodious voice and his son's increasingly confident notes. He listened to the long silences between songs, a silence that was no longer empty, but full of understanding and learning. One afternoon, he heard something new, laughter. First Isabella's, warm and infectious, and then a breathy, guttural sound from Leo. It wasn't a full laugh, but it was the precursor to one, a sound of genuine joy he hadn't heard since Elena was alive. Arthur felt a wave of gratitude for Isabella so intense it was almost painful. This woman, with her simplicity and her musical soul, was achieving what all his money couldn't buy. She was returning life to his house and his son. But as his gratitude grew, a new and unsettling emotion began to emerge, a deep curiosity about who Isabella Rossi really was. the woman who hummed Puccini arias while dusting furniture. Arthur's curiosity about Isabella grew from a whisper to a pressing need. He watched her from afar, trying to decipher the woman behind the melody. She moved through the house with a quiet dignity, treating every object, whether a priceless Ming vase or a simple toy of Leo's, with the same reverent care. But it was in the music room that she truly transformed. There, she was not the cleaner. Her posture changed. Her expression grew more intense. And when she sang, even softly to guide Leo, there was a quality to her voice, a depth and control that spoke of more than just natural talent. It spoke of training. One evening, after Leo was asleep, Arthur found her in the kitchen, making a cup of chamomile tea. A gentle exhaustion hung about her, but her eyes still sparkled. "Isabella," he began, the formality in his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "May I ask you a question?" She turned, a soft smile on her lips. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood." "Your voice," he said, searching for the right words. "It's not just beautiful, it's trained. Where did you learn to sing like that?" The question seemed to surprise her. For an instant, a shadow of something that looked like old pain passed through her eyes. So quickly, Arthur almost thought he'd imagined it. She turned to the counter, stirring her tea, the spoon clinking softly against the porcelain. "It was a long time ago," she said, her voice a little lower than usual. "In my youth, in Italy." She paused, and Arthur waited, feeling he was on the threshold of an important revelation. "I wanted to be an opera singer. I studied at the Milan Conservatory. It was my dream, my life." The confession hung in the air between them. Isabella, the cleaner, had studied at one of the most prestigious conservatories in the world. The image was so incongruous with the role she played in his house that Arthur struggled to process it. He thought of his own world, where success was measured in profit, in market share, in accumulated assets. Her dream was measured in art, in beauty, in passion. "What happened?" he asked gently, the instinct of a businessman seeking the full story behind a balance sheet. Isabella sighed, a sound heavy with the weight of past decisions. "Life happened. My father became ill. He had a small family business, an olive oil shop. My brothers were too young. The responsibility fell to me." She turned to face him, and in her eyes was no self-pity, only the quiet acceptance of a chosen path. "Family comes first. Always. So, I gave up my career to take care of them and the business." She shrugged, a small gesture that contained a universe of sacrifice. "And I don't regret it, but sometimes I miss the music. I miss the stage." In that moment, Arthur understood everything. The depth of her empathy for Leo's pain didn't just come from her kind nature, it came from a place of recognition. She wasn't just a woman who loved music. She was an artist, a soul who knew intimately the pain of a silenced passion, of a voice that could no longer sing as it once had. The discovery shook him to his core. He had hired her on a whim, on a single line in a bio. He had seen her as a tool, a means to an end. Now he saw her as an equal, a person of immense talent and depth who had made a sacrifice he, with all his wealth, might not have had the strength to make. The cash flow of his empire suddenly seemed trivial compared to the wealth of spirit in the woman before him. Meanwhile, Leo's progress continued to blossom. The music was unlocking doors inside him. His voice began to return, first in song. During their piano sessions, he started to sing along with Isabella, his voice small and a little hoarse from disuse, but gaining strength each day. And then the words began to come. The first was not Mama or Dad. It was during an afternoon when he was struggling with a difficult passage on the piano. Frustrated, he looked at Isabella and said, with surprising clarity, "Help." The simple word, the first he had spoken in over a year, sounded to Arthur, who was listening from the hall, like the most beautiful of arias. and it was directed not to him, but to the woman who had given him back his music. The word help was the key that opened the floodgates. After it, other words began to flow, first like a hesitant trickle, then like a river. They were simple at first: water, book, more piano. Each new word was a quiet celebration for Arthur and Isabella. They would exchange glances over Leo's head, looks that shared the weight of the past and the joy of the present. Arthur felt like an investor watching a high-risk venture, made purely on gut instinct, begin to yield returns beyond all projection. Hiring Isabella hadn't been a business decision, but it had become the best investment of his life. He began spending more and more time with them in the music room, no longer as a hidden spectator, but as a participant. He had no musical talent himself, but he would sit in one of the velvet armchairs, listening, offering an encouraging smile, simply being present. The dynamic between the three of them deepened into something that resembled a family. They ate dinner together at the enormous dining room table, once used only for formal business banquets. The sound of silverware and hesitant conversation replaced the funereal silence. Leo, with Isabella's gentle prodding, would tell his father about his day, about the songs they were learning. Arthur, in turn, found himself talking not about stocks or deals, but about his own day, simplifying the complex concepts of his work into stories a 7-year-old could understand. He spoke of building things, of helping companies grow, trying to connect his world with the tangible, creative world Isabella and Leo were building at the piano. He realized that for years, he had managed his assets, but had neglected his most important one, his relationship with his son. With the return of Leo's speech came a new wave of memories. One night, as Isabella was tucking him in, he pointed to a photograph of Eleanor on his nightstand. "Mommy sang to me," he said, his voice small but clear. "She called me my little maestro." The nickname, which Arthur hadn't heard in so long, hit him with a bittersweet force. He sat on the edge of the bed, his heart heavy with longing and gratitude. "Yes, she did," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "And you are." The pain of Eleanor's loss would never vanish, but now it was mingled with the joy of seeing his son reconnect with those memories, not as sources of trauma, but as sources of love. And it was Isabella who had made it possible. She had turned pain into music. The news of the miracle at the Blackwood estate spread quietly through the circles that had once offered therapies and diagnoses. Mrs. Higgins's former team of psychologists called curious, asking for reports and data. Arthur politely dismissed them. He didn't need charts to measure his son's happiness. He just needed to hear the sound of his laughter echoing through the halls. Leo's school, which had placed him in a special needs program with little hope for integration, called to schedule a reassessment. During the meeting, the school psychologist was astonished. Leo answered her questions, spoke about his newfound love for the piano, and even hummed a melody he and Isabella had learned. It was then that the psychologist mentioned the upcoming school talent show. "It's a wonderful opportunity for the students to express themselves," she said, looking at Leo with new respect. "Leo, would you like to participate?" Arthur held his breath. It was a huge step, a leap from the safe sanctuary of the music room to a public stage. He turned to his son, ready to say that he didn't have to, that it was okay. But before he could speak, Leo looked at him, his eyes shining with a determination he had never seen before, and said a single word that sealed his future. Yes. Leo's yes kicked off 2 weeks of an emotional intensity Arthur had never experienced, not even during the most volatile stock market crash. The talent show, a trivial school event for most families, became for them the climax of an excruciating and miraculous journey. The decision on what to perform was instant and unanimous. It would not be an opera aria or a folk song. It would be Elena's lullaby. It was the first melody Leo had played, the bridge that connected him back to the world, and the piece that held his mother's soul. The music room transformed from a healing space into a rehearsal studio. The atmosphere was a mix of excitement and anxiety. There were days when the melody flowed effortlessly, Leo's voice, still small but gaining clarity, weaving with the notes of the piano. On those days, the hope in the house was so palpable, Arthur felt he could touch it. But there were other days when the memory and the pressure became too heavy a burden. One afternoon, in the middle of a rehearsal, Leo stopped abruptly. His fingers froze over the keys, and he stared into space, his face pale. The silence returned, the old enemy hovering in the room. Arthur felt an icy fear creep up his spine. Had he pushed his son too far, too fast? Was their fragile progress about to shatter? He took a step forward, ready to intervene, to call the whole thing off. But Isabella, with her unshakable calm, placed a gentle hand on Leo's shoulder. She didn't say, "Keep going," or "You can do it." She simply began to hum the lullaby, very softly, not as a performance, but as a reminder. She brought him back not with pressure, but with the gentleness of the music itself. After a long moment, Leo took a deep breath, and his fingers began to move again. The danger had passed. On the night of the show, the atmosphere backstage at the school auditorium was a chaos of excited children and nervous parents. Arthur felt his heart thumping against his ribs, harder than it did before any major deal. He had never felt so powerless. His entire fortune, his influence, his multi-billion-dollar deals meant nothing here. Success or failure rested entirely on the courage of a 7-year-old boy. Leo was pale under the harsh lights, his small hands cold. He stared at the red velvet curtain as if it were an insurmountable mountain. Arthur knelt in front of him. "Leo, you don't have to do this," he said, his voice full of a desperate sincerity. "We can go home. No one will mind." Leo looked at his father, and then his eyes sought out Isabella, who stood a few feet away, offering him a smile that was a beacon of tranquility. He squeezed his father's hand. "I want to," he whispered. "D for Mommy!" When Leo's name was called, a hush fell over the audience. People knew his story, the boy who wouldn't speak. The curiosity and pity were palpable. Arthur found his seat in the front row, feeling hundreds of eyes on him. Isabella sat beside him. She was not an employee in that moment. She was the co-architect of this instant. The curtain opened, revealing a large black grand piano in the center of the stage, looking huge and intimidating. And there was Leo, a tiny figure walking toward it. He climbed onto the bench, which seemed like an oversized throne, and the silence in the auditorium became absolute. For a moment that felt like an eternity, he just sat there, looking at the keys. Arthur stopped breathing. Every second was an agony. He felt Isabella's hand find his, a gesture of silent solidarity. Then, Leo raised his hands. He took a deep breath, a sound that was picked up by the microphone and echoed through the hall. And then he played the first note, clear, pure, and perfect. The melody of the lullaby began to fill the auditorium. And after the first few bars, he opened his mouth, and in a voice that trembled but was surprisingly strong and clear, he began to sing. Leo's voice, still holding the sweetness of childhood, but weighted with the wisdom of one who has known deep pain, soared over the silent auditorium. He sang the lullaby his mother composed for him, a melody that was both a lament and a celebration. Every note he played on the piano was precise. Every word he sang a declaration of overcoming. Arthur Blackwood, the billionaire accustomed to controlling every variable, was completely undone. Tears streamed freely down his face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of catharsis, of a relief so profound, it felt like it was washing away years of anguish and helplessness. He looked at the stage and saw not his fragile, traumatized son, but a musician, an artist who had found his voice, both literally and metaphorically, through the universal language his mother had bequeathed to him. Beside him, Isabella was crying too, but her tears were silent, almost unnoticeable. They were the tears of a mentor, of a musical soulmate who saw her own sacrificed dream reborn in the courage of this child. She had given Leo the key to the music room, but he, in return, had unlocked a part of her heart she thought was lost forever. The performance was not technically flawless. There was a wavering note here, a word sung slightly off-key there, but it was emotionally perfect. When the last note of the piano faded into the air, a deep, reverent silence held the auditorium. It lasted only a second, but in that second, everyone in the room felt they had witnessed something sacred. And then the audience erupted. The applause was thunderous, a wave of sound that enveloped Leo on the stage. People weren't just applauding a talented child. They were applauding the resilience of the human spirit. Leo, stunned by the reception, looked out at the crowd, and his eyes found his father's. Arthur was on his feet, clapping with a force that made his hands ache. He was smiling and crying at the same time, a portrait of pure, unadulterated joy. And then Leo's gaze shifted to Isabella, and he gave her a small smile, a recognition of the irreplaceable role she had played in his journey. The curtain closed. Backstage, Arthur swept his son into a fierce hug, lifting him off the ground. "You were magnificent," he whispered into Leo's ear. "Your mother would be so proud." "She heard," Leo replied, with a simple, profound certainty that pierced Arthur's heart. Later that night, the estate, once a sanctuary of silence, was filled with a happy calm. Leo, exhausted but radiant, was fast asleep in his bed. Arthur and Isabella sat in the living room, the lights low, an untouched glass of wine on the table between them. The weight of the past months, and especially of this night, hung comfortably between them. "I don't know how to thank you," Arthur said, his voice low and sincere. "You saved my son. You saved me." Isabella looked at him, her gentle eyes reflecting the soft lamplight. "I did nothing, Mr. Blackwood. I just opened a door. Leo and the music did the rest." Her humility moved him. "Please," he said, "call me Arthur." He paused, gathering the courage to say what was in his heart. A confession that was more frightening than any high-stakes negotiation. "Isabella, at first, I hired you as an employee, but you've become so much more. You brought music back to this house, but you also brought life, hope, love." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights that represented his empire. "This whole net worth," he said, gesturing to the view. "Stocks, funds, investments. None of it has any value compared to what you've given us. I've fallen in love not with the woman who cleaned my house, but with the woman who filled it with music again. The woman who taught me that the greatest asset of all is human connection." He turned to face her, his heart pounding. "I know this is sudden, and perhaps inappropriate, but I have to say it. Isabella Rossi, will you marry me?" The question hung in the air, more impactful than the eruption of applause in the auditorium. Isabella looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise, but in them, Arthur saw the same light of hope and recognition he saw in his son's eyes. Arthur's question hung in the silent living room, as delicate and potent as the final note of a symphony. Isabella didn't answer immediately. She looked at Arthur, the man who commanded a financial empire, but who now stood before her with the vulnerability of an open heart. She saw past the billionaire, past the vast fortune and countless assets. She saw a father who desperately loved his son, a man who had been lost in his grief and who, like Leo, needed help finding his way back. She thought of her own life, of the dream she had sacrificed for duty and for love of her family in Italy. She had never regretted it, but she had always felt the echo of an empty stage in her soul. In this house, in these past months, she had not found a stage, but she had found a purpose. Teaching Leo wasn't a job, it was a rediscovery of her own essence. Healing him had, in a way, healed herself. A slow, genuine smile lit up Isabella's face, a smile that reached her eyes and dispelled any doubt that might have lingered in Arthur's heart. "Yes," she said, her voice soft but firm, a single word that held an entire future. "Yes, Arthur, I will marry you." The relief and joy that flooded Arthur were deeper than any profit he had ever made, more valuable than his entire net worth. He stepped forward and, for the first time, took her hands, not as an employer or a grateful friend, but as a partner. It was not a moment of overwhelming passion, but of deep, serene recognition, the harmony of two souls who had found solace and strength in each other. In the months that followed, the Blackwood estate completed its transformation. Where once there was oppressive silence and sterile order, now there was life. Leo's laughter became the most common sound in the hallways, a melody far more precious than any opera aria. The music room remained the heart of the home, but it was no longer a shrine to painful memories. It was a vibrant studio, a place of creation. Isabella continued to teach Leo, no longer as a caregiver, but as a mother. Together, they explored the vast world of music, their afternoons at the piano becoming a duet of love and learning. Arthur, in turn, found a new kind of return on investment in his life. He was still a brilliant businessman, but his focus had shifted. He began to measure his wealth not in dollars or stock points, but in the moments he spent with his family. He learned to unplug from the constant cash flow of the financial world to plug into the flow of love in his own home. The wedding was a small, intimate ceremony held in the estate's garden, under an arch of jasmine, Elena's favorite flower. It was an event not about the merging of fortunes, but the merging of hearts. Leo was the best man, holding the rings with a proud seriousness. And as Arthur and Isabella said their vows, he sat at the small white grand piano they had placed on the lawn and played the lullaby. The melody was no longer about loss, it was about continuity, about how love and music can transform but never truly die. Arthur understood, in that moment, that the cure for his son and for himself was not in forgetting Elena, but in finding a new way to honor her memory, by letting her music live on and become the soundtrack to a new beginning. The